Don't make me say it again. Jedediah's voice hit the cabin walls like a rifle shot. I can't control myself around you, and I've survived war. I've survived this mountain. I've survived 15 years of nothing. But you... His hand slammed the doorframe, Knuckles' white jaw, locked tight. You walked out of my blizzard and into my bones, and I don't have a single defense left standing. Charlotte stood her ground, heart hammering, eyes steady. This man had dragged her from the snow with his bare hands, had kept her alive by sheer stubborn will. And now the most dangerous thing on Wolverine Peak wasn't the cold. It was him. If this story already has your heart beating faster, hit that subscribe button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next inside that cabin will change everything you think you know about loneliness, survival, and the terrifying thing we call love. The stagecoach never should have taken the Wolverine Pass route in January. Every man with sense in Caldwell County knew that. The pass was a widow-maker in summer and a coffin in winter, and the only reason any driver would attempt it in a blizzard was desperation or stupidity, or a combination of the two that was more common than anyone cared to admit. The driver's name was Elias Pruitt, and he was desperate. 3 days behind schedule, a freight company breathing down his neck, and 6 passengers who had paid top dollar for express delivery to the silver camps north of Harlan's Crossing. He'd looked at the sky that morning and made a decision that cost him everything. Charlotte Whitmore felt the moment the back wheels lost the road. She was pressed against the interior wall of the coach, her traveling bag clutched to her chest, listening to the storm howl against the wooden panels like something alive and angry. The other passengers, a mining surveyor, 2 brothers heading to Harlan's to stake a claim. A preacher's wife and a freight agent had gone quiet an hour ago. Even the preacher's wife had stopped praying loud enough for the rest of them to hear. Then the left rear wheel hit the ice shelf at the edge of the pass. Charlotte heard the crack first, a sound like a rifle shot, only deeper, more final, like the earth itself splitting along a seam nobody knew was there. Then the tilt, slow at first, almost gentle, the way a man leans back in a chair before he falls, and then not slow at all. The screaming started. She couldn't tell if it was the horses or the passengers or the wind, or all three blending into one impossible sound. She grabbed the overhead strap with both hands and held on, and then the world turned sideways and the world turned dark, and the cold came in all at once, like a door kicked open. She didn't know how long she was unconscious. When she came back, everything was wrong. The coach was on its side in the snow. The door above her head, now a ceiling of sorts, was hanging open, and through it she could see nothing but white. Absolute white. Wind like a living thing shrieking through the gap. She tried to call out. Her voice came back to her in pieces, swallowed by the storm before it could travel 2 feet. "Hello," she called. "Is anyone—" She already knew. The silence inside the coach had a specific weight to it. The kind of silence that settles after something final has happened. She pulled herself upright, her left arm screaming where it had struck the wall, and looked around. The surveyor's neck was at an angle no living man's neck should ever be. The freight agent had gone through the forward window. The brothers, she couldn't see the brothers past the wreckage of the dividing partition. The preacher's wife was very still, her rosary clutched in one white-knuckled fist. "Ma'am," Charlotte said. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Nothing. She stopped checking. She focused on the only thing left to focus on: the open door above her head, the howling white beyond it, and the simple arithmetic of survival that had no room for grief. She would grieve later, or she would not grieve at all, but either way, she had to get out of this wreck before it became her tomb. It took her 11 minutes to climb out. She counted because counting was the only way to keep her mind from doing what it wanted to do, which was fold in on itself and go somewhere quieter and warmer, where none of this was happening. When she finally dragged herself over the edge of the doorframe and dropped into the snow outside, the cold hit her like a physical blow. Not cold like a winter in Philadelphia. Cold like punishment. Cold like the world had decided it was finished with her and was making its position clear. The wind knocked her sideways immediately. She couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. The coach was a dark shape behind her, already half buried, already becoming part of the landscape, as if it had always been there. She could see no horses, no road, no trail markers, nothing but white pressing in from every direction, and the wind and the cold that was already working its way through her traveling coat and her wool dress, and the 2 petticoats beneath it, like they were made of paper. She started walking. She didn't know which direction. She chose the direction that felt slightly less like walking into a wall and slightly more like moving through something, and she walked, and the snow was up to her knees in places, and the wind was trying to take her off her feet with every gust, and she was cold in a way that was starting to feel less like cold and more like sleep. That was when she first understood she was going to die on this mountain. The understanding arrived quietly, almost politely, the way bad news sometimes does when it has already accepted that you can't outrun it. She was going to die up here. Her legs were slowing. Her thoughts were slowing. The world was narrowing down from white to gray, and from gray toward something darker, and the darkening felt peaceful in a way she didn't have the energy left to fight. She went down on one knee, then both knees. "Get up." The voice came from inside her own head, sharp and impatient, the voice her mother had used when Charlotte was 7 years old and wanted to quit learning her letters. "Charlotte Ann Whitmore, you get up right this minute." She tried to get up. She couldn't. The cold had moved past pain now and into something worse, something that felt like kindness, like the storm was gentling her toward the end instead of forcing her there. She could feel the snow against her cheek. She hadn't noticed lying down. The wind had quieted somehow, or maybe she just couldn't hear it anymore, the way you stop hearing a clock ticking in a room you've been sitting in long enough. She thought about Philadelphia, about the townhouse on Arch Street and the parlor with the blue wallpaper and the smell of her mother's sachets in the linen closet. She thought about the letter she'd written to her sister 2 days ago, sitting in the hotel room in Caldwell, telling her that the journey west was fine, that she was fine, that everything was perfectly fine, and she'd write again from Harlan's Crossing. She thought about Richard Peyton, and then she stopped thinking about Richard Peyton, because even hypothermia wasn't enough to make those thoughts comfortable. She closed her eyes. Something grabbed her arm. Not gently. "Hey." The voice was rough, stripped down a voice that had gone a long time without practice. "Hey, look at me. Open your eyes." She opened her eyes. He was crouching over her in the snow, a big man broad through the shoulders wearing a coat that had seen better decades and a hat pulled low against the wind. His face was weathered to the color of old saddle leather jaw, buried in a dark beard going gray at the edges, and his eyes, even in the dim white murk of the storm, even through the fog thickening in her mind, were the sharpest things she'd ever seen. Gray-green, the color of mountain water, utterly without warmth, and utterly completely awake. "Can you stand?" he said. I didn't ask what you think. I asked if you can stand." There was no gentleness in it, no cruelty either. Just a flat demand from a man who apparently did not have time for the luxury of soft phrasing, and something in its bluntness cut through the fog better than kindness might have. She tried to stand. He didn't wait for her to fail. He got an arm under her shoulders and hauled her upright with the efficiency of a man who had carried weight across hard terrain before and found sentiment to be excess baggage. She gasped at the sudden movement, at the pain in her arm, flaring back to life as feeling returned. "That hurts," she said, which was possibly the most useless thing she had ever said in her life. "Better than the alternative," he said. He kept moving. She had no choice but to move with him. His grip was iron, his pace was set, and the storm didn't seem to affect him the way it was affecting her. He walked into it like a man walking through a room he knew with his eyes closed. "Where are we going?" she managed. "Cabin." "Is it far?" He looked at her sideways. "Far enough that you should save the conversation." She saved the conversation. She didn't know how long they walked. Her sense of time had stopped working somewhere back there in the snow next to the overturned stagecoach, and she hadn't missed it until she needed it. Long enough that her feet went numb again, after briefly not being numb. Long enough that the man beside her had to take more of her weight as the minutes stretched and her legs decided they'd had enough of being useful. He didn't complain about it. He just took the weight and kept walking. She caught herself thinking that was the strangest thing about him. Stranger than his silence, stranger than the fact that he'd appeared out of a blizzard, like something the mountain had simply produced because it felt like it. The strangest thing was that he adjusted for her. Every time she stumbled, he was already compensating before she finished stumbling. Like he'd done this before. Like he knew exactly how much a person could carry before they couldn't carry it anymore. The cabin appeared through the white so suddenly it startled her. It was small, low-roofed, built heavy against the mountain, like it was trying to become part of it. The logs so dark with age, they looked almost black against the snow. A single window, with the amber glow of a fire behind thick glass. A door so solid, it looked like it had been cut from a single piece of mountain. He pushed it open and pulled her inside. The warmth hit her like a wall. She would have sat down immediately on the floor if he hadn't steered her toward the chair nearest the fireplace. A heavy handmade thing, no cushion, built for function, not comfort. She sat. The fire was enormous, built with the logs of a man who lived alone and had no one to impress and no wood to conserve. It radiated heat like a small sun. She looked around the cabin in the way that people look around unfamiliar spaces when they're trying to understand what kind of person lives in them. What she saw was a life stripped to its essentials. A single bed against the far wall, military neat, a wool blanket pulled tight as a drumhead. A table with one chair. A shelf of tools, each hanging precisely in its place. Traps. A rifle. Cooking implements of the most basic kind. A woodworking bench along the near wall with curls of pale shavings drifting to the floor, and a half-finished carving sitting in the middle of it. A wolf, she realized, rendered in extraordinary detail, caught mid-stride with its head turned, as if it had heard something approaching from behind. Everywhere she looked, wolves, carved from wood, every size, every pose. On the shelf, on the windowsill, arranged along the mantel above the fireplace with the careful attention of a man curating the only collection he cared about. Nothing else. No photographs, no letters, no personal effects that she could see. No evidence of anyone else who might have ever shared this space. He had stripped his life down to the studs. "Take off the coat," he said. He was at the far end of the cabin, his back to her, pulling something from a wooden chest near the bed. "Excuse me?" she said. He turned and looked at her. The look was not unkind. It was also not the look of a man who expected to repeat himself. "Your coat is wet through," he said. "And your dress. You keep that wet clothing on your skin, you'll freeze from the inside out no matter how hot this fire burns. I've got a blanket. You can have it. But you need to lose the wet layers." She stared at him. He stared back. "I don't know you," she said. "No." He agreed. "You don't." "I can't simply, a woman doesn't." "Ma'am," he said, and his voice didn't rise, didn't sharpen, just got very level and very patient in the way of a man who had run out of a great many things over the years, but had found patience in the empty space left behind. "You were face down in the snow when I found you. You had maybe 5 more minutes before that was permanent. I'm not asking you to do anything improper. I'm asking you to do something that keeps you alive. Those are different things." She looked at the wolves on the mantel. She looked at the fire. She looked at the coat she was wearing, which was soaked through with snowmelt and already steaming gently in the cabin's heat, doing nothing to warm her, and in fact, pulling warmth away from her skin every second it stayed on. "Turn around," she said. He turned around without a word. She stripped off the coat, the wool dress beneath it, her traveling blouse. She sat in her underclothes by a stranger's fire in the middle of a Montana blizzard and accepted the blanket he held out behind him without looking, and she wrapped it around herself and said, "All right." He turned back. He moved to the fire and added 2 more logs without looking at her again, without making her feel that he was trying very hard not to look at her, which she appreciated more than she had words for right then. He simply turned his attention to the fire, as if she'd always been sitting there, and the sitting was unremarkable. "What's your name?" she said. A pause. long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Holt," he said. "Jedediah Holt. Charlotte Whitmore," she said. "I was on the stagecoach from Caldwell." Another pause. "The others, I looked for them. The other passengers. They were—" "I know," he said. "You saw them. I tracked the wreck before I found you. I know what happened to the coach." She waited. "There's nothing to be done for them tonight," he said, and his voice was careful now in a specific way, the way of a man who has learned to be careful around grief because he knows what carelessness in its vicinity can cost. "In the morning, if the storm breaks, I'll go back down. But tonight there's nothing." She absorbed that. It wasn't easy to absorb. She sat with it for a moment, the weight of what she'd witnessed inside that coach, the silence of the preacher's wife with her rosary, the surveyor's broken neck. She sat with it, and then she set it carefully aside, because she had learned from her mother from years in a household that ran on the twin engines of propriety and endurance, that grief had its proper time and place, and that right now she needed all of herself for the business of not dying. "How long will the storm last?" she said. He shrugged. It was an expressive shrug, the kind that conveyed an entire philosophy about the relationship between men and weather. "Until it doesn't. Could be 1 day, could be 3. 3 days. Could be." She pulled the blanket tighter. "And the nearest town?" 14 miles south. Harlan's Crossing, another 12 north. Either way, not in this weather. 14 miles in a Montana winter storm. She might as well have asked about the moon. "So I'm staying here," she said. "You're staying here," he confirmed. The fire popped. Outside, the storm was saying everything it had to say about that arrangement, howling its objections at the heavy walls of the cabin, which listened politely and held. "Mr. Holt," Charlotte said, "I want you to know that I am grateful. I understand you didn't have to do what you did. I understand I might have. I know what would have happened if you hadn't found me." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "I almost didn't," he said. She looked at him. His jaw shifted. "I almost kept walking." She didn't know what to do with that honesty. It was the kind of honesty that didn't come wrapped in apology or explanation, the kind that simply handed you the truth and let you figure out what to do with it. "But you didn't," she said. "No." He picked up a carved wolf from the end of the workbench, a small one barely larger than his fist, and turned it in his hands without seeming to know he was doing it. "No, I didn't." The fire burned. The storm raged. And Charlotte Whitmore, sitting wrapped in a stranger's blanket in a stranger's cabin at the top of a mountain that had just tried to kill her, watched Jedediah Holt turn a carved wolf in his hands and thought about the word almost, and about all the ways a single moment of hesitation could redirect the entire current of a life. She slept eventually in the chair because exhaustion is the great equalizer, and it doesn't care about propriety or awkwardness or the particular strangeness of one's circumstances. She slept and she didn't dream, which was probably a mercy. She woke to the smell of coffee. He was at the small iron stove, his back to her, working with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to feeding only himself, but adapting without complaint. He'd reloaded the fire. Her coat and dress were hanging from pegs near the fireplace, steaming gently, almost dry. He heard her stir and didn't turn around. "Coffee in a minute," he said. "I've got salt pork and hardtack. It's fine," she said. "Whatever you have." He brought the coffee in a tin mug without ceremony and set it on the arm of the chair and went back to the stove. She wrapped both hands around it and felt the warmth spread up through her arms like something returning from very far away. "How long was I asleep?" she said. 4 hours, maybe 5? "You didn't sleep." He didn't answer that. She looked at the workbench and saw that the half-finished wolf from the night before was sitting exactly where it had been. No new progress made on it. She looked at the single chair at the table and the single bed against the wall, and understood that he had spent the night sitting somewhere she couldn't see, keeping watch over a stranger who'd arrived in his life without invitation, giving up his chair and his sleep without being asked and without expecting thanks. "Mr. Holt," she said. "Holt is fine." "Holt, then." She looked at him. You live up here alone? Yes. For how long? His back stiffened slightly. Just slightly. The kind of tightening that a man tries to suppress and mostly succeeds at suppressing, but not entirely. 15 years. The number landed in the room like something heavier than a number. By choice, she said. He turned then. Looked at her directly for the first time since she'd woken, those gray-green eyes level and unreadable, and carrying the specific weight of someone who had decided a long time ago that certain questions didn't deserve the luxury of a moment's consideration before answering. Yes, he said. She held his gaze. That's a long time to be alone. It's a long time, he agreed. You get used to it. Do you... His jaw tightened. He turned back to the stove. The pork's ready, he said. She took the pork, and she ate it, and she did not push. She had pushed men before her father Richard, the various functionaries and gatekeepers who had tried over the years to manage her trajectory, and she had learned that there was a particular kind of man who could not be pushed anywhere he hadn't already decided to go. Jedediah Holt was that kind of man, obviously and completely. But she also knew that such men could be waited on, that they had things inside them that wanted out, that had been pressing against the walls they'd built for a long time, and that sometimes patience was the only key that worked. She would wait. She had, it seemed, nothing but time. The storm provided the morning's entertainment in the sense that it made all other entertainment impossible. After breakfast, if salt pork and hardtack and black coffee could be called breakfast, which Charlotte decided they absolutely could, given the alternative, she watched him work at the bench. He'd picked up the wolf again and was working at it with a small curved blade, slow careful strokes that gradually revealed the shape inside the wood. It was hypnotic in a way she didn't entirely expect. Where did you learn to do that? She asked. Taught myself. You're very good at it. He made no response to this. Do you sell them the carvings? A short, almost silent laugh. The kind that acknowledges something ridiculous without committing to the effort of actual amusement. No. Then why do you make so many? The blade stopped for a moment. Just a moment, then started again. Something to do with the hands, he said. Keeps the mind from going places it doesn't need to go. She sat with that for a moment, turning it over. There was a whole autobiography in that sentence if you knew how to read it. What places? She said. He looked at her over his shoulder. That look again, flat, measuring the look of a man, deciding how much of his interior landscape he's willing to let a stranger survey. Ma'am, he said, I appreciate that you're a curious woman. I suspect it served you well. But there are things in this cabin that belong to me, and things that belong to you, and I'd prefer we each kept to our own side of that line. She felt the rebuke and accepted it. Of course. I apologize. He turned back to the wolf. She looked around this cabin again, at the walls stripped of everything personal, at the single chair at the table, at the bed built for one and made with the precision of a man who found comfort in order because order was the only thing you couldn't have stripped away from you. And then she looked at the one thing in the cabin that didn't fit the stripping away, on the highest shelf above the wolves and the tools and everything else almost hidden in the shadows, where the ceiling came low, a small wooden box. Plain dark, with handling the kind of box that had been opened many times, and held carefully when opened and closed with the deliberate care of something precious. She almost asked. She didn't ask. She had agreed to keep to her side of the line, and she meant it, and she was a woman who meant what she said. But she noticed the box, and she filed it away. The storm lasted through the day and into the second night, and the second night was when things began to shift. Not dramatically. Not the way things shift in stories that don't care about truth. Gradually, the way ice thaws, not all at once, but by degree, in the spaces between the cold, where warmth finds the edges first and works its way inward. He told her that second night that he'd been a Union cavalry sergeant in the war. She hadn't asked. He'd simply said it sitting at his workbench with his back to her, the way a man sometimes says things into the middle distance, because saying them directly to another person costs too much. She said, Were you at Gettysburg? Chancellorsville, he said. Fredericksburg. Cold Harbor. A pause. A few places between those that don't have names in the history books. That's a lot of war. It was a lot of war, he agreed. Is that why you came up here? He was quiet for a long time. The fire had burned low. She hadn't moved to add wood, and he hadn't either, as if neither of them wanted to break the particular quality of the quiet that had settled. Partly, he said at last. What's the other part? He turned then fully and looked at her across the dim, warm interior of the cabin, and his face in the firelight had something in it she hadn't seen before. Not softness exactly, but the memory of softness, like the shape left in the ground where a stone has been lying for a very long time. I had a wife, he said. Her name was Mary. Charlotte waited. She died. Winter of '64. We were expecting. His voice was very flat, very controlled. The voice of a man who has said something many times in his own head and taught himself how to say it without breaking, but doing so requires every bit of control he possesses. Both of them, the same night. I'm sorry, Charlotte said. She said it quietly without the elaborations that people often add to grief because they can't tolerate the rawness of it unadorned. Just those 2 words, because those 2 words were enough, and anything more would have been about her discomfort rather than his loss. He nodded once, turned back to the bench. After that, he said, there didn't seem to be a reason to be anywhere that anyone else was. The fire popped. A log shifted. That makes sense, Charlotte said. And she meant it. He glanced at her over his shoulder, and something in his expression shifted. A micro-movement barely there, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't paying the specific kind of attention she had found herself paying to this man since the moment he'd hauled her out of the snow. He looked surprised. Not that she'd said it, that she'd meant it. What about you? He said after a moment. Where were you going? She considered how much to say. Harlan's Crossing. That's not an answer. No, she said. It isn't. He waited. She was discovering a man who could wait, who understood that silence was not empty, but rather a space where important things could choose to arrive if they were given room. I was going north, she said, to put as much distance as possible between myself and a man in Philadelphia who believes that the fact that I accepted his proposal 3 years ago constitutes a permanent arrangement, regardless of whether I still wish to honor it. Jedediah Holt was quiet for a moment. He followed you, he said. He has the means to follow me anywhere, she said. And the temperament. What kind of man is he? The kind, she said carefully, who uses the word mine about people. She watched him absorb that, watched the particular quality of stillness that moved through him when he did not the easy stillness of a man at rest, but the very different stillness of a man deciding something. Well, he said at last, he can't follow you up here, not in this storm. No, she said. I suppose he can't? She looked at the fire. She thought not yet, but she didn't say that. Outside, the wind screamed one last time against the walls of the cabin, throwing itself at the heavy logs with everything it had, the way desperation always ends not in victory, but in exhaustion. And then, very slowly, the pitch of it began to change, to lower, to move from fury toward something that sounded, if you listened carefully, almost like surrender. The storm was breaking. And inside the cabin, 2 people sat in the warmth of a fire that neither of them moved to tend, and the silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was something else. Neither of them had a name for it yet. Neither of them reached for one, but it was there present, and warm, and as real as the wolves carved from mountainwood, as real as the box on the highest shelf that Charlotte hadn't asked about, as real as the name Mary, which was now between them, in the room no longer just his grief, but something they had briefly and irrevocably shared. Jedediah picked up the small carved wolf from the bench. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he set it on the arm of Charlotte's chair without a word, and went to add wood to the dying fire. She picked it up. The wolf was caught mid-stride, head turned, ears forward, alert to something approaching from behind. She understood, looking at it, that he had been making the same wolf over and over for 15 years. Not because he was afraid of what was coming, because he was waiting for it. The morning the storm broke, Jedediah was already gone before Charlotte opened her eyes. She knew it the way you know certain things in unfamiliar spaces by the quality of the silence, by the particular stillness of a room that has recently been vacated rather than one that was never occupied. The fire was built up fresh, which meant he'd been up before dawn, moving quietly around her, while she slept in the chair, with the carved wolf still in her hand. She set the wolf carefully on the arm of the chair, and stood her body cataloging its complaints from the night before: the bruised arm, the stiffness in her back from sleeping upright, the residual ache in her fingers, where the cold had worked its way deepest. She ignored all of it with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had learned early that the body's complaints were rarely the most important thing happening in a room. She went to the window. He was moving through the snow below the cabin, already 30 yards out, a dark figure against the blinding white of a cleared morning, heading down toward the pass. Going back to the wreck. Going to do the thing he'd said needed doing quietly, without ceremony, before she was awake to watch him do it. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and watched him until the tree line swallowed him up. Then she turned and looked at the cabin in full daylight for the first time. What she'd missed in the fire-lit dark the night before was the detail. The workmanship in the furniture, every piece handmade mortise and tenon, no nails, the joinery of a man who had learned to do things correctly, because out here there was no one to call if something failed. The shelf of wolves in the morning light was something else entirely. She counted 23 separate figures, ranging from a piece barely 2 inches tall to one nearly a foot. All different, all rendered with the same extraordinary attention to anatomy and motion. A man didn't make 23 of the same animal without that animal meaning something specific to him. She made coffee on the iron stove, found the process by trial and inference, and a brief period of stubborn experimentation with the damper that produced more smoke than she intended. When it was done, it was stronger than she was used to, and she drank it anyway, and felt more herself for it. She was on her second cup when she heard him on the porch. The door opened, and he came in with the cold on him, stamping snow from his boots, pulling off his hat. He stopped when he saw her at the stove. "You made coffee," he said. "I hope that's all right." He looked at the stove, back at her. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read. Not displeasure, not its opposite either. Something more complicated than both. "It's fine," he said. He poured himself a cup and stood at the far end of the table and drank it, and she watched him over the rim of her own cup and waited. "The coach is buried," he said. "Deep. The snow shifted in the night and covered most of it. I found what I found." He paused. "The passengers are gone. There's nothing to recover until the spring thaw, and by then the county sheriff will have to deal with it." "Gone?" she repeated. I mean the mountain takes things," he said, not unkindly, "and gives some of them back in the spring. I've seen it before." She absorbed that. Let it settle the way hard truths settle when you've already done the first round of shock and have moved into the steadier territory of acceptance. "Did you find anything of mine among the wreckage?" "Traveling bag, black leather brass clasps. It was under the axle. Some of what's inside is wet, but it's there. I left it on the porch." She set down her coffee and went to the door and brought in the bag and sat with it at the table and went through it with methodical attention. Her extra dress was soaked, but salvageable. Her mother's cameo brooch wrapped in a handkerchief was intact. A small journal, its cover warped with moisture, but the pages inside still legible. And at the very bottom, tucked inside a leather document wallet, the envelope. She looked at it for a moment. Richard Peyton's name wasn't on it. It didn't need to be. She recognized the handwriting on the outer fold, because she had spent 3 years learning to dread that particular slant of letters. "Something important," Jedediah said. He wasn't looking at her. He was back at the bench, pulling on his leather work gloves, picking up his tools. "Old business," she said. She folded the wallet and set it aside and took out the journal instead, opening it to the last entry. 3 days ago in Caldwell. The ink had run slightly at the edges of some words, ghost traces of letters bleeding into the margins, but she could still read it. She had good handwriting. Her mother had seen to that. She read what she'd written, and then she closed the journal. She hadn't written what she was actually doing on that stagecoach. She hadn't written what she was actually running from. She had written careful, pleasant observations about the journey, the landscape, the other passengers' clothing, a description of the hotel dining room, and the quality of its biscuits. She had been writing for an audience that might someday read those pages, which meant she had been writing for Richard, or for the version of herself that Richard had spent 3 years carefully constructing. She realized, sitting in a stranger's cabin in the Montana wilderness with all of her careful obfuscations slightly water-damaged, that she was furious. Not at the stagecoach or the storm or the mountain. At herself. For 3 years of careful, pleasant journal entries that had nothing to do with what was actually happening to her. "You all right?" Jedediah said. She looked up. He was watching her from the bench, just a glance quick, the kind that pretended to be incidental, but wasn't. "Fine," she said. "You look like something made you angry." "Something did? You want to talk about it?" "No," she said. And then, almost immediately, "Yes, maybe." She set the journal on the table. "Do you ever look back at something you've done and realize that you were performing it, not actually living it, just performing it, as if there was an audience?" He was quiet for a moment, working at the wolf in his hands. "Yes," he said. "And then you stop performing, and you realize everything you built while you were performing has to be taken apart." "Yes," he said again. Lower this time. She looked at him. "How do you do it? Take it apart without losing yourself in the process." He set the knife down very carefully on the bench. He turned around and leaned back against it and looked at her with those gray-green eyes. And the morning light was on him fully now, and she could see things in his face that the firelight had hidden the depth of the lines, the specific locations where grief had carved itself into him, the way his whole face was a landscape of things that had happened to it. "You don't," he said. "You lose yourself. That's the part nobody tells you. You lose the version of yourself that was performing, and for a while there's just nothing there. Just empty. Like a room cleared out." He picked up the knife again. And then, very slowly if you're patient, something real starts to come back. It's smaller than what was there before. Simpler. But it's actually yours. The fire crackled. Charlotte looked at the journal on the table. Then she picked it up and set it on the floor beside her chair. She would write something true in it later. For now, she needed a moment to sit with the fact that a man she'd known for 1 day and 1 night had just described her next 10 years more accurately than she could have described them herself. "You're very honest," she said. "Only currency I have left," he said. "Everything else got spent." They settled into the day, the way two people settle into unfamiliar shared space, tentatively. At first, then with increasing competence, each finding their orbit around the other without announcing it. She mended her dress by the fire, using a needle and thread from her bag. He worked at the bench. She asked him around mid-morning where the water came in from, and he told her there was a covered barrel on the north side of the cabin, fed by a pipe from the stream, and she found it and brought in 2 buckets, without asking his permission, and he said nothing about it, but she noticed his jaw shift when she came back in, the way it shifted when something surprised him, and he was deciding whether to acknowledge the surprise. She didn't acknowledge it either. She just put the water on. Around noon she found the other box. Not the one on the high shelf, she hadn't forgotten that one. Just set it aside in the way you set aside questions that need more trust before they can be asked. This was a different box, small and tin, sitting on the second shelf between 2 carved wolves, and it wasn't closed all the way. The lid was slightly raised, catching the light, and she could see the edge of something inside it, paper folded. She was reaching for it without thinking, the reflex of a curious woman who had spent 31 years letting her hands go ahead of her better judgment, and then his voice came from directly behind her. "Don't." She pulled her hand back, as if the tin had burned her. She turned. He was much closer than she'd realized. He moved quietly for a large man, the habit of someone who had spent years with no one around to hear him coming, and his face was different. Not angry. Something that lived underneath anger in the territory that anger exists to protect. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. I didn't mean to pry." "You were absolutely meaning to pry," he said. Not unkindly, simply accurately. She didn't try to deny it. "You're right. I'm sorry." He looked at the tin box for a moment. Something crossed his face, a weather system of competing impulses, moving fast, resolving into something she couldn't name. "My wife's letters," he said. "The ones she sent me during the war." The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the snow settling on the roof. "Jedediah." "I read them every Sunday," he said. "I have for 15 years. 7 letters. I've read them enough times that I have every word of every one by memory, but I read them anyway." He stopped, seemed to catch himself at the edge of something. "That's the first time I've said that out loud to another person." Charlotte looked at the tin box, at the 7 letters inside it that a man had read every Sunday for 15 years in a cabin in the Montana wilderness, because they were all he had left of the woman he'd loved, and the life that was supposed to come after the war. She felt something move in her chest that was not pity. Pity would have been an insult, but was the closest thing to grief by proxy she'd ever experienced. She was lucky to have someone love her like that, Charlotte said carefully. His jaw worked. She deserved better than ending up in a box on a shelf. She ended up read every Sunday by a man who remembers every word. I'm not sure many people are loved that consistently. He looked at her. She held his gaze and did not look away, because looking away would have made it smaller than it was. "You're a strange woman, Miss Whitmore," he said. "Charlotte," she said. A pause. Charlotte. It was the first time he'd used her given name, and they both noticed it, and neither of them addressed the noticing. He went back to the bench. She turned back to the shelf, looked at the tin box for one more moment, and then walked away from it, with the same deliberate care she used on all the things she'd agreed not to touch. That afternoon she asked him to teach her to carve. He turned around from the bench and looked at her with an expression that suggested this was either the most practical or the most impractical thing anyone had said to him in 15 years, and he hadn't yet determined which. "You'd need a knife," he said. "You have several. You'd likely cut yourself." "Probably," she agreed. "I'd like to try anyway." Something shifted in his face again. That micro-movement she was starting to learn to read, the one that appeared when something surprised him, past his defenses, before he could get the defenses in position. He reached to the bench and selected a small knife, shorter blade, better balanced for an inexperienced hand, and a piece of soft pine the size of a tobacco tin, and he brought them to the table and set them down in front of her. He sat across from her. "What do you want to make?" he said. "I don't know." "What do you start with?" "Start with understanding what's already in the wood." He picked up the pine block and turned it in his hands. "You're not putting something into it. You're finding what's already there. The shape is in the wood before you touch it. You're just taking away what isn't it." She looked at him. "That sounds like philosophy more than woodworking." "The two aren't as different as people think," he said. He set the block down in front of her. "Hold it in your left hand. Your left, it's less likely to slip. Now the knife in your right blade pointing away from you, and make one stroke. Don't try to carve anything. Just make one stroke and feel how the wood responds." She made the stroke. A thin curl of pale wood peeled away. The resistance of it was not what she'd expected, more complex grain pushing back in one direction and releasing in another. "Again," he said. She made another stroke. "Better." "You're fighting it," he said. "Stop fighting the grain. Follow it." "How do I know which way the grain goes?" He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, just for a moment, just long enough to angle the knife differently against the wood, his rough, calloused fingers over her smoother ones, and made one stroke with her hand under his. The wood responded entirely differently. Smooth, clean, the knife moving with the material instead of against it. He pulled his hand back immediately, sat straight, looked at the bench. "Like that," he said. His voice was the same, absolutely the same, but she could see in the particular set of his jaw and the deliberate quality of his stillness that he was aware, completely acutely aware, of the fact that he had just touched her hand, and that awareness was taking some effort to manage. She looked at the wood, made another stroke this time, following the grain the way he'd shown her. "Better," he said. He didn't look at her. "Thank you," she said. She didn't look at him. They spent the next 2 hours like that, him telling her trying occasional brief instruction, the quiet of two people doing focused work together. The pine block began to take a shape she hadn't planned, emerging in a direction of its own choosing, and at some point she realized it was going to be a bird. She hadn't decided that. It was simply what the wood was. "It's a bird," she said. He glanced over. "Looks like it. I didn't plan that." "You don't always plan it," he said. "Sometimes you just follow and see what arrives." She looked at him. He was looking at the wolf in his hands. She thought about the 7 letters in the tin box, about a man who had followed his grief up a mountain and stayed there for 15 years, about what it meant that she was the first person he'd handed a knife to since Mary. She cut herself 20 minutes later. Not badly, a shallow slice across the pad of her left thumb, and she made a sharp sound and pressed it to her mouth before she could think about it. He was across the table and had her hand in both of his before she'd registered he'd moved. He turned her thumb toward the light and examined the cut with the focused attention of a man assessing a practical problem, and the care with which he held her hand. Not tight, not loose, exactly the right pressure, as if he'd calibrated. It was disproportionate to the injury, and they both knew it. "It's shallow," he said. "Stay there." He went to the shelf and came back with a strip of clean cloth and wrapped her thumb with a neatness that spoke to practice. She watched his hands while he worked. Scarred at the knuckles. Missing the tip of the small finger on his left hand, something she hadn't noticed before. The hands of a man who had built and fought and worked for 40-something years and had the record of all of it in his skin. "You've done this before," she said. "Field dressing. More times than I'd like to count. In the war and after." He tied off the cloth, didn't release her hand immediately, then became aware that he hadn't released it, and did so sitting back, picking up his own work again. "Jedediah," she said. "Holt? I've been calling you Jedediah in my head since last night, and you gave me leave to call you Charlotte, so I think we're past the point where Holt is necessary." He looked at her for a long moment. "Jedediah," he repeated. Not agreeing or disagreeing. Just hearing what it sounded like coming from someone else's mouth for what was clearly the first time in a very long time. "Is that all right?" she said. "It's fine." He said the way he said things were fine when he meant something more complicated than fine. She was learning the vocabulary. The translations were coming easier. Evening came down fast and hard, the way evenings come in Montana in January. Not gradually, not gently, but like a door closing on the day. He cooked. She helped without being asked, anticipating where to be useful with the instincts of a woman who had run a complicated household for 3 years, under the eye of a man who regarded inefficiency as a personal insult. Jedediah noticed. She could tell he noticed. He said nothing. They ate at the table with the single lantern between them, and she thought about how strange it was that this felt less awkward than most dinners she'd had in Philadelphia. "Tell me about the war," she said. He looked up from his plate. "Not the battles," she said quickly. "Not the specific." She shook her head. "Tell me what you remember most. Not what happened, what you felt." He was quiet for long enough that she thought she'd pushed too far again. Then, "Cold," he said. "I remember being cold more than anything else. Not winter cold, not mountain cold like this. A different kind. The kind that gets inside you when you've seen enough to change how you understand the world, and you can't get warm again, because the cold is on the inside." She waited. "Mary's letters were the only thing that could get through it," he said. 7 letters in 3 years. 3 years of war, and she managed 7 letters, which is when I think about what it must have taken her, how she managed to get them through where she found the words. He stopped. His hand tightened slightly on his fork, and then released it. I would read them until I had them memorized, and then I would read them again just to have the act of reading them. What did she write about? Charlotte said. The farm, the neighbors, the things growing and the things that weren't, small things. He looked at the table. She knew. She understood that what I needed wasn't grand words. She wrote about the color of the sunrise on a particular morning, the way our dog had learned to open the back gate by himself and kept escaping into the cornfield. The corner of his mouth moved barely briefly, the ghost of something. The same dog. 3 letters running she was writing about his escapes. Like the most important news from the home front was that Chester had decided the cornfield was his by right. Charlotte smiled. He saw it. Something in him shifted. Not dramatically, a single degree of movement, like a door opening a crack to show there was warmth behind it after all. She sounds wonderful, Charlotte said. She was the best person I ever knew, he said simply. Not a complicated assessment, just the most accurate one. The lantern flame bent in some draft from the walls. Charlotte looked at it. I've never had that, she said. Someone who knew exactly what I needed. What do you mean, Richard, my fiancé? He knew what he needed. He was very good at identifying that and then providing it for himself, using whatever and whoever was available. The skill for what other people need. She paused. He didn't have that. Or if he did, he never applied it to me. Then why did you accept his proposal? The question was direct. Not accusatory. She was learning that Jedediah Holt didn't traffic in accusation, only in direct inquiry, which was its own kind of rare. Because I was 28, she said, and my father had just died, and Richard was there with all of his certainty and his plans and his enormous capacity to make decisions that relieved other people of the burden of making their own. And I was very tired. She looked at her plate. Grief makes you accept arrangements you wouldn't accept if you were at full strength. I understand that now. You understand it, Jedediah said. Do you forgive yourself for it? She looked up. His face was even, genuine. The question was not rhetorical. I'm working on that, she said. That's honest, he said. It's the only currency I have left, she said. His words back to him. He looked at her for a moment, then looked away. But not before she saw it, the thing she was starting to recognize, the warming the wall taking on heat from the fire she hadn't intentionally started in him, the crack running up its center that was widening by degree. She did the dishes. He dried them, which was not a thing she'd expected, and he did it with the same methodical efficiency he applied to everything, and they stood at the basin working in companionable silence. And she thought, this is what it would feel like. This specific thing. This right here. She didn't let herself finish the thought. It was too early for that thought. It was possibly the most dangerous thought available to her in this cabin. She finished the dishes instead. Later, he gave her the bed. She started to argue, and he said, I've slept on worse than this floor for years at a time, and I'm still here. Take the bed. And there was nothing in his voice that invited further discussion, so she took the bed. She lay in it and looked up at the ceiling and listened to him settle on the floor near the fire, heard his breathing slow and even out. The man could sleep the way he did everything else efficiently, without drama, committed entirely to the task. She looked at the ceiling and thought about 7 letters read every Sunday for 15 years. She thought about his hand on hers over the knife. She thought about Chester the dog and the cornfield, and Mary, who knew that what her husband needed was the color of a particular sunrise, and she felt something she hadn't felt in years, the specific ache of wanting something you hadn't known was available to want. She closed her eyes. Outside the cabin, the mountain was quiet, in the way mountains are quiet after a storm. Not peacefully, but watchfully, as if holding its breath before the next thing arrived. Inside, very slowly, something that had been dead for 15 years was considering the possibility of motion. It didn't announce itself. It didn't ask permission. It simply began the way the most important things always do, in the space between sleeping and waking, in the dark, in the warmth, while two people lay close enough to hear each other breathe and pretended in their separate ways that they were not listening. At 4 in the morning, Charlotte heard him get up. She heard him go to the shelf. She heard the soft sound of a tin lid being lifted and replaced. A paper being unfolded gently with the practiced care of a man who has done it so many times. He knows exactly how much pressure each fold can take before it starts to fail. Sunday, she thought. He said he reads them Sundays. Today was Sunday. She lay completely still and breathed evenly and let him have it. This private ritual, this act of faithfulness to the dead, this Sunday, that had been his alone for 15 years, and she felt no need to insert herself into it, and no desire to only a kind of witnessing that was as close to reverence as she could manage. He read for a long time. She didn't know if he was reading or simply sitting with the letters in the dark. The fire was low. She could hear the night outside the cabin, the mountain's watchful silence, the occasional crack of cold contracted wood. Then she heard something she hadn't expected. Very quietly, barely above a breath, she heard him say a name. Mary. Just that. Not a prayer or a lament. Just a name said into the dark, in the voice of a man who has been saying it to no one for 15 years and has made a form of companionship out of the saying. Charlotte closed her eyes. And then, because she was a woman who did not always succeed at controlling what her body did, while her mind was focused elsewhere, she cried. Silently, completely into the pillow that smelled like cedar and wood smoke and 15 years of solitude. She cried for him and for Mary, and for the unborn child, and for 7 letters in a tin box, and for the fact that the most faithful love she had encountered in her 31 years of life belonged to a man in a mountain cabin who was not hers and might never be. When she was finished, she lay still. In the dark, she heard him refold the letters, heard the tin lid settle, heard him say very quietly, so quietly she couldn't be certain she hadn't dreamed it, "I'm sorry, Mary." Then silence. Then, after a pause, long enough to hold a conversation that was happening somewhere she couldn't hear, "I know." Charlotte Whitmore lay in the dark, her eyes open, her heart completely rearranged from where it had been the day before, and listened to the mountain hold its breath. She didn't tell him she'd heard. She made that decision before the sun came up, lying in his bed with her eyes open and her mind running the arithmetic of what honesty would cost versus what silence would protect. He had given her something the night before, not intentionally, not as a gift, but the way people give things when they believe they're alone. When they reach into the deepest part of themselves and bring something up because the dark and the quiet have made them temporarily forget that the world contains witnesses. To tell him she'd heard would be to take that thing and put a frame around it, make it an object between them, and it was too fragile yet for that. So she said nothing. When she came to the fire that morning, he already had coffee, poured her cup, set at the edge of the table, at the angle she'd used the 2 days before. He had noticed without appearing to notice how she liked things. The observation was so quiet and so practical and so entirely unlike Richard Peyton's ostentatious attentiveness, the kind that always required an audience to witness the attentiveness, that it hit her somewhere low in the chest and stayed there. "Sleep all right?" he said. His back was to her. "Fine," she said. Neither of them pushed on that. She sat and drank her coffee and watched him build the fire higher against the morning cold, and she thought about the word he'd said in the dark. Mary, and about what he'd said after the apology, and then the response to something she hadn't heard. And she thought that whatever conversation he'd had in that dark, with whoever still lived in that tin box, it had left him different this morning. Not lighter exactly. More like a man who has set down a weight long enough to feel the shape of his own hands again. He turned from the fire and looked at her and caught her watching him, and she didn't look away. He said, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "You're looking at me like you're figuring something out." "I'm always figuring something out," she said. "It's a character flaw." His mouth did that thing, the ghost movement, the fraction of a smile that appeared and retreated so fast you could convince yourself you'd imagined it. "Drink your coffee." She drank her coffee. It was the 4th day. By the 4th day, the arithmetic of the cabin had reorganized itself around 2 people without either of them deciding it should. She had moved her mending to the table near the window, where the light was better, and he had adjusted his morning wood splitting to account for her being on the porch in the late afternoon, which she'd taken to doing for 20 minutes each day because the cold and the open air reminded her that the world beyond the cabin still existed. He always had something hot waiting when she came back in. He never made a point of it. She had found on the third day the photograph. It was tucked inside the back cover of a dog-eared farmer's almanac on the bottom shelf, and she hadn't been looking for it, had simply pulled the almanac out to see what year it was from, and the photograph slipped out and fell to the floor, face up. A woman. Young, 20 perhaps, 22, sitting very straight in a photographer's chair, her hands folded in her lap, wearing her best dress, by the look of it. Dark hair. A face that was not conventionally beautiful, but was enormously alive. Something in the eyes that the long exposure of the daguerreotype had not quite managed to kill some quality of brightness that survived the stillness the process required. She had picked it up carefully and looked at it for exactly as long as it took to understand what she was looking at. And then she had placed it back inside the almanac, and replaced the almanac on the shelf in the precise position she'd found it. She had told herself she'd looked at it to know, to understand what she was contending with, what lived in this cabin alongside the wolves and the tin box and the 15 years of silence. She told herself that. She didn't entirely believe herself. That afternoon on the porch, she let herself think about it directly for the first time. The woman in the photograph was dead. Had been dead for 15 years. Jedediah Holt had built his entire life around. That death had shaped himself to fit around the space of it, the way a tree grows around a stone, taking its form from the obstacle. Everything in the cabin was organized by that absence. Every carved wolf was a conversation with it. Every Sunday with the tin box was a maintenance of it. She was standing in the middle of his grief, like a woman who had walked into someone else's house and started rearranging the furniture. Not intentionally, not maliciously. But the rearranging was happening anyway, and she could feel it, and she suspected he could too, which was why he moved 3 degrees more carefully around her with every passing day, the way you move carefully around something that hasn't decided yet whether it's going to fall. She came back inside, and he was at the bench, and he looked up when she came in. The automatic look of a man who has started listening for a specific sound without deciding to. And she saw it happen, the brief, unguarded moment of relief in his face, when she came through the door, gone so fast it might have been a trick of the light, and then the careful neutrality back in place. Her heart did something inconvenient, and she addressed it silently and firmly, and moved to the stove to start supper. "Charlotte," he said. She turned. He was looking at the bench, not at her, the knife still in his hand. "I need to say something, and I'm going to need you not to respond until I'm finished, because I'm only going to be able to say it once." She waited. He set the knife down. He pressed both hands flat on the bench in front of him, a man bracing against something. "I don't know what's happening in this cabin. I have some ideas, but I'm not a man who trusts his ideas about this particular subject anymore. I trusted them once, and then I had 15 years to think about what trusting them cost. So..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I'm going to need you to help me understand what you want, because I cannot." Another stop. Longer. "I am finding it difficult to be in the same room as you without..." He turned then finally and looked at her, and his face was stripped all the way back, the careful composure gone entirely, and what was underneath it was raw and real and a little frightened. "I can't control myself around you." The fire crackled. Charlotte stood very still. "Not in the way that sounds," he said immediately. I would never..." "I know," she said. "It's not Jedediah." Her voice was quiet. "I know what you mean." He looked at her. "You mean," she said carefully, "that you have spent 15 years knowing exactly who you are and what you feel and what you will allow yourself to feel, and that something in the last 4 days has made that knowing unreliable. And that scares you, because the last time your knowing was unreliable, you lost everything." His chest moved with a breath he hadn't meant to take. "Yes," he said. The word was barely a sound. "Then you should know," she said, that I am in exactly the same position, and I am also frightened, and I have considerably less excuse for it than you do, because I haven't lost the things you've lost, and I'm still frightened, which tells me that it has less to do with our particular histories, and more to do with—" She stopped, chose the honest word. "This." She gestured between them. Not dramatically, just a simple movement of her hand through the air between them, indicating the space and what it contained. He looked at the space. He looked at her. "You're leaving," he said. "When the pass clears." "I don't know what I'm doing when the pass clears," she said. "You were going north." "I was running," she said. "Running and going north are the same direction, but they're not the same thing." His brow furrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't have a destination, Jedediah. I had a direction. There's a difference." She put her hands flat on the table the way he'd put his on the bench, mirroring him without deciding to. "I have no family north of here. I have no home north of here. I have a letter from a man in Philadelphia and enough money in my bag to last 6 months, and after that—" She stopped, shook her head. "I was solving for distance, not for destination. I hadn't planned past the distance." "That's not safe," he said, quiet, almost to himself. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He was very still. "Charlotte," he said. And the way he said her name was different from any of the times before. Not careful, not measured, not the practiced neutrality of a man maintaining distance. Just her name said by someone who had started to mean it. She felt it move through her like the first warmth after the cold. "Don't," she said softly. He stopped. "Not yet," she said. "We don't know each other. We've had 4 days in a cabin in a blizzard, and 4 days, isn't it? Isn't enough to make the decisions that are sitting at the end of this conversation. So not yet." His hands came off the bench. He picked up the knife again. "All right," he said. "But I need you to know," she said, "that I heard what you said, and I wanted you to know that I hear it." He nodded once, turned back to the wolf. The supper got made and eaten with a quiet between them that was different from all the previous quiets, charged, aware of itself, the kind of silence that knows what's living inside it and is being very careful not to move too fast. She washed the dishes. He dried them. Their hands crossed once over the basin, and neither of them commented on it, but neither of them moved away quickly either. That night she lay in his bed and did not sleep, and knew from the particular quality of the silence from the floor that he was not sleeping either. The next morning he told her about the accusation. He said it the way he said hard things directly without preamble, because he had found that preamble made him lose his nerve, and his nerve was one of the few things he'd held on to. "There's something you should know," he said, "before this goes any further between us. Before you make any decision about staying or going or anything else. You should know why I really came up here." She set down her coffee. "It wasn't only Mary," he said. "It was the war, yes, and it was Mary, yes, but there was something else." His voice was level, absolutely level in the way of a man who has been over this particular terrain so many times that he can walk it in the dark without stumbling. "After Fredericksburg, I had under my command, there were 12 men, my cavalry unit. We were ordered to take a position that our commanding officer knew was compromised. He'd had intelligence that Confederate sharpshooters had flanked us on the east side of the ridge, and he sent us anyway because taking the position was worth more to him than the 12 men standing between him and it." He stopped. "7 of my men died in the first 2 minutes. I pulled the remaining 5 back, countermanded the order. That saved 5 lives," Charlotte said. "And ended my commission," he said. "There was a hearing. The officer, Colonel Aldridge, had friends in Washington and a story that was cleaner than mine, and I had no friends in Washington and 7 dead men who couldn't speak for themselves." He looked at the table. "They found me guilty of dereliction, stripped my rank, unofficial understanding that I was to go away quietly and not cause trouble." His jaw tightened. "So I went away." Charlotte looked at him. "Aldridge is still alive," Jedediah said. He's a state senator now, Montana Territory. He got elected 2 years ago and set up in Helena, and I've been on this mountain knowing he's 60 miles south of me and doing very well for himself on the back of the 7 men he killed." The flatness in his voice then was not emptiness. It was the specific sound of a man who has compressed enormous heat into a very small space and learned to keep it there. "If anyone in Harlan's Crossing finds out I'm up here, there are still men who served under Aldridge who would be very happy to revisit certain questions about Fredericksburg." Charlotte was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you don't go down?" she said. "Why you don't go to town? Why you've kept yourself invisible up here all this time?" "Partly. And the other part is Mary." "Yes." She looked at her hands on the table, turned something over in her mind that needed turning before she could look at it from the right angle. "Jedediah," she said, "the man who saved 5 soldiers' lives by countermanding an illegal order that was going to get them all killed, that man is guilty of dereliction. That's what the record says. And the record was written by the man who gave the illegal order. Aldridge had 3 officers testify to his version of events. Were they present? 2 of them. 1 was not. And the other 4 men, the 5 you saved minus 1, where are they now?" He was very still. "Why?" "Because I want to know if they're alive," she said. "Because if they are, they're witnesses, and witnesses who are breathing are worth considerably more than the testimony of a man who sent 12 soldiers into a compromised position to protect his own military record." "Charlotte, I want to know their names," she said. "You are not—" He stopped, looked at her. "What exactly are you proposing?" "I'm not proposing anything yet. I'm gathering information." She held his gaze. "I was engaged for 3 years to a man who knows every attorney, judge, and political functionary between Philadelphia and Helena, Montana. I know how those men think. I know how their systems work and where they have gaps, and what kinds of pressure they respond to." She paused. "I also know a newspaper editor in Denver who has been looking for a story about corruption in the Montana Territory government for the better part of a year, because he told me so at a dinner party 6 months ago, and I didn't think I would ever have a use for that information." Jedediah stared at her. "You weren't running away from Philadelphia," he said slowly. "I was running away from Richard," she said. "But I was also running toward something. I didn't know what it was yet. I thought it might be the kind of distance where the past couldn't follow." She looked at the window. "I didn't expect it to be a mountain with a man at the top of it who got court-martialed for saving people's lives. It's not that simple. I know it's not that simple. None of this is simple. But simple isn't the only way things can be real." She looked back at him. "Give me the names." "No. Jedediah, I said no." He stood pushed back from the table, crossed to the window. "I appreciate what you're trying to do. I understand the impulse. But you do not know what Aldridge is capable of. You do not know what happens to people who make noise in his direction. There was a man in Harlan's Crossing 18 months ago who started asking questions about the land grants Aldridge had brokered. That man had an accident with his horse on a clear day on a flat road." He turned from the window. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" She understood. "And you think keeping quiet has kept you safe?" she said. "It's kept me alive." "It's kept you buried alive," she said. "There's a difference. And I think somewhere inside you, you know there is." His eyes went sharp. Not angry, she had not seen him angry not once in 5 days, which was itself a kind of information. What she saw instead was the focused intensity of a man who has just heard something land directly on a nerve he thought he'd armored past feeling. "That's not your call to make," he said. "You're right," she said. "It isn't. I'm sorry." She meant it. She stopped, found the honest thing. "I look at you, and I see a man who has been punished for doing the right thing and who then punished himself additionally just to make certain the punishment was thorough enough. And I cannot—" Her voice caught slightly. She steadied it. "I cannot sit across from that and say nothing. The fire, the silence, the mountain outside holding its breath." He came back to the table, sat down, put his hands flat on it again. That gesture she'd learned was him anchoring himself against something large. Their names, he said, are Thomas Garrett William Suggs, Marcus Beale, and Henry Flood. She picked up her journal and wrote them down. He watched her write them and said nothing. She said, "Where are they now?" "Garrett's in Billings, or was 2 years ago when I heard. Suggs went back east after the war. Beale and Flood I lost track of." He was looking at the journal, at the 4 names in her handwriting. "This won't be fast," he said, "or easy, or safe. I know. And it may not work at all. I know that too." He looked at her face, looked for something in it, and found it, and his own expression shifted in response, the crack in the wall present and widening the heat from outside getting in. "Why?" he said, not challenging, genuinely asking. "You came off a wrecked stagecoach 5 days ago. You're trying to get away from a man who has been hunting you across half the country. You have every reason in the world to concentrate entirely on your own situation. Why would you take on mine?" She looked at him. "Because yours matters," she said, simply, completely. The way true things are said when you've run out of room to dress them up. His breath moved. "Charlotte," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." They sat with it for a moment, what was between them, what had no name yet, what was too new and too raw and too large for the room they were in, but was in the room anyway, undeniably like a third person who had arrived without knocking. Then he did something she didn't expect. He reached across the table. He covered her hand with his, not briefly, not accidentally the way it had happened over the knife. Deliberately, fully. His scarred hand over hers, the missing fingertip of his left hand, just at the edge of her wrist, and he held it there. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I haven't," he started. "I know," she said. "I don't know how to." "Neither do I," she said. "Not really. But I think that might be all right." Outside, something changed. A sound. Not the mountain's usual vocabulary of wind and settling wood and distant animal movement. Something else, lower, more deliberate. Jedediah heard it before she did. His head came up the same motion as the wolf on the bench, caught mid-stride, head turned, ears forward. Alert to something approaching from behind. His hand came off hers immediately. He stood. "Stay here," he said. "What is it?" He was already moving to the rifle on the wall. He checked it with the quick, practiced efficiency of a man who has been checking rifles in moments of alarm for 30 years, and the ease and speed of it reminded her suddenly and completely that this gentle, quiet man who carved wolves and read letters on Sunday mornings had also been a cavalry sergeant in the bloodiest war in American history. "Horses," he said. "More than one. Coming up from the south." Charlotte felt the cold arrive in her chest. Not the cold of the mountain, the cold of recognition. "How many horses?" she said. He moved to the side of the window, looked out at an angle. "3, maybe 4. A pause. "There's a 4th man on foot." Another pause, and his voice changed, dropped into a register she hadn't heard from him before, flat and hard, and absolutely without uncertainty. "One of them is wearing a city coat, black wool, too heavy for riding, someone who doesn't spend much time on horseback." Charlotte stood up. "Jedediah," she said. "You know who it is," he said. Not a question. She was already at her bag, pulling out the document wallet. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. She'd imagined this moment before the moment when Richard caught up, and had always imagined herself afraid. But what she felt was something else entirely. Something harder and colder and more useful than fear. "His name is Richard Peyton," she said. "He's brought men with him. He usually does. He doesn't like to be the person holding the weapon, only the person giving the order to use it." She pulled the document wallet and held it. "He'll have papers. He'll claim legal standing. He's very good at making illegal things look like paperwork." Jedediah was still at the window. His body had changed. The posture she'd learned over 5 days, the careful deliberateness of a man governing his own movements with conscious attention, was gone. What was there instead was something older and more instinctive. The particular stillness of a man who has been in situations that required quick, correct decisions, and has learned that the decision-making happens before the movement, not during it. How dangerous are his men? He said. Hired, she said. Paid to intimidate, not to kill. Richard is cruel, but he isn't stupid. He needs me returned, not... She stopped. He needs me intact. Needs, Jedediah said, and the word came out like something struck off a piece of flint. He has business interests that are tied to my name, she said, and to certain documents that are tied to my name. His access to them is conditional on our marriage. She held up the document wallet. This is why he followed me. Not sentiment, not love, these papers. Jedediah turned from the window and looked at her. She had rehearsed this moment in her own head many times, the moment she would explain to someone what Richard Peyton actually was, as opposed to what he appeared to be. She had rehearsed it with her sister, and with her mother before her mother died, and with herself in hotel rooms all the way from Philadelphia to Caldwell. She had imagined the explanations would take a long time and require a great deal of evidence and still be met with skepticism. Jedediah looked at the document wallet in her hand, looked at her face, looked at the window where 4 men were coming up the mountain on horseback. What do you need? He said. Not, do you believe me? Not, are you sure? Not, let me think about this. What do you need? Charlotte felt something break open in her chest, not painfully the way things break when they're being destroyed, but the way a seed breaks open when it's been in the dark long enough and the soil has finally warmed. I need you to let me handle him first, she said. Whatever he says, whatever authority he claims, let me answer it. He's expecting a frightened woman. I'm not that anymore. Jedediah held her gaze. And if he's not satisfied with words, he said. Then, she said, and her voice was steady and clear and entirely her own, I imagine that's when it becomes your turn. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he went to the door. He opened it and stepped out onto the porch and stood there in the January cold with his rifle at his side and his eyes on the 4 figures coming up through the snow, and Charlotte Whitmore came to stand beside him. Not behind him. Beside him. She stood on that porch in borrowed warmth with Richard Peyton's papers in her hand and Richard Peyton himself coming up the mountain toward her, and she felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember entirely like herself. Below them, the lead rider pulled up his horse. Even at this distance, she recognized the set of his shoulders, the particular posture of a man who has never in his life arrived anywhere without being certain he was expected and would be accommodated. Richard Peyton looked up at the cabin, looked at the man on the porch, looked at Charlotte, and she watched him understand in real time that something was different, that the woman standing on that porch in the Montana wilderness was not the woman who had been carefully and systematically reduced over 3 years into something manageable and portable. He had followed her to the top of a mountain. He had no idea what was waiting for him at the top. Charlotte straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and looked Richard Peyton directly in the eye across the distance between them, and she did not look away. Richard Peyton took his time dismounting. That was the first thing. He always took his time with entrances, had a theatrical instinct for the pause that made other people aware of their own waiting, made them feel the waiting as a form of submission. Charlotte had watched him do it at dinner parties and boardrooms and courthouse steps, and she had spent 3 years interpreting it as confidence. Standing on Jedediah's porch with the cold at her back and the document wallet in her hand, she saw it for what it actually was. He was afraid. Not of Jedediah. Not yet. He hadn't assessed Jedediah yet, was still in the part of his calculation where the man with the rifle was a variable to be managed rather than a threat to be respected. He was afraid of her. Of the fact that she was standing upright on a porch in the Montana wilderness instead of being found in pieces at the bottom of a mountain pass, which had clearly been one of the outcomes he'd considered and perhaps hoped for. He handed his reins to the man beside him and walked forward through the snow with his hands clasped behind his back, the posture of a man conducting an inspection. "Charlotte," he said. His voice carried easily in the cold air. Even pleasant the voice he used in rooms full of people he intended to impress. "Thank God, I've been beside myself." "Richard," she said. He stopped 10 feet from the porch steps and looked up at her, and the pleasantness in his face was doing the work of pleasantness, while his eyes did something entirely different. His eyes were moving Charlotte to Jedediah's rifle, the cabin behind them, back to Charlotte, down to the document wallet in her hand. There. That. The smallest tightening around his eyes when he saw the wallet. "You found my papers," he said. "They were in my bag," she said, "which was in my possession, which makes them mine. Now, Charlotte, you sent those documents with me deliberately," she said. "You put them in my bag before I left Philadelphia without telling me. I found them in Caldwell." She held the wallet up slightly. "I've had 5 days to read them carefully, all of them." Something shifted behind Richard Peyton's pleasant expression. Not much. The kind of shift that only someone who had spent 3 years learning his face would notice. "We should discuss this privately," he said. "We're very private up here," Jedediah said from beside her. Richard looked at him fully for the first time. Did the assessment Charlotte had seen him do with men he didn't know, quick thorough the inventory of a man who understood power primarily in terms of social and financial leverage and was running through the categories: class, education, connection, wealth. He found nothing in Jedediah Holt's weathered face and old coat and rifle that registered in any of those categories, and the finding settled him slightly, which was a mistake. "I don't believe we've met," Richard said. "No," Jedediah said. "Richard Peyton, of Philadelphia." He said it the way men said it when Philadelphia was supposed to function as a credential. "Jedediah Holt," Jedediah said. "Of here." Richard's mouth made a brief attempt at a smile. "Mr. Holt, I'm grateful to you for sheltering my fiancée during the storm. Truly, you'll be compensated for your trouble." "I don't need compensation." "Nevertheless." "I said I don't need it." Jedediah's voice hadn't changed volume or pitch. It simply arrived with a quality of finality that most men managed only by shouting. Richard heard it. Recalibrated. "Of course." He turned back to Charlotte. "My darling, you must be exhausted. These men," he gestured to the 3 riders still mounted behind him, "will escort you down to Harlan's Crossing. I've arranged rooms. We can talk properly once you've had a chance to rest, and—" "I'm not going to Harlan's Crossing with you," Charlotte said. The pleasantness dropped approximately 2 degrees. "Charlotte, I'm not going anywhere with you. Not today, not next week, not ever." She kept her voice even. She had practiced this not specifically, not in advance, but in the 5 days of finding herself again in a mountain cabin, practiced the thing of saying exactly what she meant in exactly the words that meant it without softening the edges to make it easier to receive. "The engagement is over. It was over when I left Philadelphia. I should have said it then in clear language, and I didn't, and I'm saying it now." Richard Peyton was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the pleasantness was entirely gone, and what replaced it was something she'd seen before, only in private, in rooms with closed doors, in the moments when the performance became too expensive to maintain. "You don't seem to understand your situation," he said. "I understand it completely," she said. "Those documents. Describe a property transfer arrangement structured to give you legal claim to my father's estate upon our marriage," she said. "Disguised as a joint investment vehicle. I've read every page, Richard, twice." She tilted her head slightly. "My father was a careful man. I don't believe he understood what he was signing." Richard's jaw moved. "Your father signed those documents voluntarily." "My father signed those documents 6 weeks after his first stroke," she said. "When his signature looked like this." She opened the wallet, drew out 1 page, held it so he could see the shaking, uneven script at the bottom, rather than like the man who signed every business document of his career for 40 years. Silence. One of the hired men shifted in his saddle. "Those papers," Richard said, "are legal and binding, and your father's physician will attest to his competency at the time of signing." "Your father's physician," Charlotte said. "Not mine. A Dr. Hargreaves of Walnut Street, whom I have never met, whom my father never mentioned, and whose certificate of medical practice I intend to verify very carefully." She closed the wallet. "Shall I continue, Because I have several more pages of notes. Richard Peyton looked at her for a long moment. Then he did something she hadn't anticipated. He laughed. It was short and genuine and entirely without warmth. "My God," he said. 5 days with a mountain man, and you've completely lost your sense of what's reasonable." "I've found it," she said. "That's the difference." He turned to Jedediah. His tone changed, dropped into the register menus with other men when they want to communicate a shared understanding, a masculine practicality that women are not supposed to be privy to. "Mr. Holt," he said, "I don't know what she's told you, but I want you to understand that Charlotte has been under considerable strain since her father's death. She has a tendency under stress to construct narratives that—" "Stop," Jedediah said. Richard blinked. "I beg your pardon. I said stop." Jedediah stepped forward to the edge of the porch. He hadn't raised the rifle. He didn't need to. He simply moved to the edge of the porch and stood there, and the sheer physical fact of him, the size, the stillness, the absolute absence of performance, changed the temperature of the conversation immediately. "I've listened to you for 5 minutes. In 5 minutes you've tried to buy me, dismiss me, and now you're trying to recruit me against the woman standing next to me by suggesting she's unstable. I've met men like you before. I know exactly what kind of man you are." Richard straightened. "And what kind is that?" "The kind that's very comfortable being the most powerful person in the room and has no idea what to do when he isn't." Jedediah looked at him the way he looked at things he was assessing, flat, thorough, without malice. "You're not the most powerful person on this mountain, Mr. Peyton. I suggest you take a moment to adjust your approach." Richard's face was very still. Then he turned to the 3 men behind him, and something passed between them, a look, a small movement of his hand, and the man on the left dismounted. Charlotte felt Jedediah's attention shift before she saw the man move. Some peripheral alertness in him that operated below the level of conscious thought, the residue of years of cavalry training knowing where every threat was tracking movement at the edges. The dismounted man's hand was at his hip. "Careful," Jedediah said. "Quiet. Absolute." The man stopped. "I don't want trouble," Richard said. "Then call your man back," Jedediah said. A pause. 3 seconds. 5. "William," Richard said. The man stepped back to his horse. Charlotte had not moved. She had not flinched. She found standing on that porch that the fear she'd been carrying for months, the specific fear of this moment of Richard finding her, had burned off completely sometime in the last 5 days without her noticing. What was left in its place was something clearer and harder and more useful. "Richard," she said, "listen to me carefully. I want you to hear every word." He looked at her. "I am not your fiancé. I am not your property. I am not a problem you can manage with lawyers and hired men and documents signed by incapacitated old men." She held the wallet at her side. "These papers are going to a judge in Helena. Not a judge of your choosing, a federal judge whose name I have, whose connection to you I have verified, does not exist. And when those papers are in front of that judge, the story they tell is going to be a very uncomfortable one for a man of your public reputation. You have no idea." "I also have a letter," she said, "already written and addressed to Mr. Gerald Foss of the Denver Tribune, who has been investigating land and estate fraud in the Montana Territory for the past year. Your name appears in his notes, I know, because he told me himself at the Harrington dinner last April." She watched his face. "I mailed the letter from Caldwell the day before I got on the stagecoach, which means it has had 5 days to travel." The color left Richard Peyton's face. Not dramatically. Gradually. The slow retreat of blood from a surface that has just understood it's exposed. "You're bluffing," he said. "I don't bluff," she said. "That was always your skill, not mine." The silence that followed was long enough to have a shape. Richard looked at this document wallet. At Charlotte. At Jedediah behind her. Back at the wallet. She could see him running the calculation every man of his type ran calculations in moments of crisis. The ledger always open assets and liabilities, the cost of pushing forward against the cost of retreating and waiting for a better angle. He was very good at the calculation. She had always known that. What he was calculating now was whether she was telling the truth about the letter. She was. She had written it in her hotel room in Caldwell at 2 in the morning, 3 days before she boarded the stagecoach, when Richard's most recent message had arrived, hand-delivered to her hotel door, by a man she didn't recognize, which meant Richard had been closer behind her than she'd realized, and the closeness had resolved something in her that had been wavering. She had written Gerald Foss a very clear letter about Richard Peyton's business methods, and her father's estate, and the documents she had in her possession, and she had walked to the post office in her nightclothes with a coat thrown over them at 2:15 in the morning and mailed it, and then she had gone back to her room and slept better than she had in months. Richard Peyton made his calculation. He looked at Jedediah. "You're harboring a woman who is subject to a valid legal—" "There's no valid legal anything on this mountain," Jedediah said. "The nearest law is in Harlan's Crossing, which is 12 miles from here down a pass that was closed for 3 days and that I control the high ground of." He picked up the rifle, then not aiming it, just picking it up the way a man picks up a tool he's had long enough that it's become an extension of his body. "I'm going to tell you this once, and I'm telling you plain. You'll leave this mountain today. You won't come back. If you do come back with more men, or with papers, or with anything else, I want you to know that I have been living on this mountain for 15 years, and I know every inch of every trail on it, and I'm a better shot than any man you can hire, and I have absolutely nothing left to lose." He let that sit for a moment. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Richard Peyton understood. Charlotte could see it in the way he stood, the slight shift of weight backward, the micro-movement of a man recalibrating distance. She had never seen anyone make Richard Peyton shift his weight backward before. "This isn't finished," Richard said. "Yes, it is," Charlotte said. He looked at her. One last look, the look of a man trying to find the woman he thought he knew inside the woman standing in front of him and not finding her. "Charlotte, go home, Richard," she said. "There's nothing here for you." He turned. He walked back to his horse. He mounted with the same theatrical deliberateness as before, but it meant something different now. Now, it was the only dignity left to him, and he was spending it carefully. He turned the horse without looking at her again. The 3 riders fell in behind him. Charlotte and Jedediah stood on the porch and watched them go, and neither of them spoke until the last rider had disappeared into the tree line and the sound of hooves on packed snow had faded entirely into the mountain's ordinary silence. Then Charlotte's hands started shaking, not from cold, from the release of something she'd been holding at a specific tension for so long that letting go of it was its own physical event. She pressed the document wallet against her chest and felt the shaking move through her arms and into her shoulders, and she stood with it breathing, letting it pass through. Jedediah put his hand on her shoulder. He didn't say anything. He just put his hand there, solid warm, the weight of it deliberate and steady, and stood beside her while the shaking worked its way out of her. "You wrote the letter," he said after a while. "In Caldwell," she said. 3 days before the stagecoach. "And the judge in Helena. Do you actually have his name?" "His name is Warren Price. He was appointed by President Hayes 2 years ago. He has no connection to Richard and a documented record of ruling against fraudulent estate instruments." She paused. "I didn't go west because I had no plan. I went west because Helena was where the plan needed to end up." Jedediah was quiet. She felt his hand still on her shoulder. "You came over Wolverine Pass," he said slowly, "in January, on a stagecoach with a desperate driver, carrying documents that could put a wealthy Philadelphia man in prison, on your way to a federal judge 60 miles north of here." He paused. "That's not running." "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." "That's an operation," he said. She almost laughed. The sound that came out was adjacent to a laugh breathed rather than voiced. "My father was a lawyer. He taught me to think in terms of evidence and procedure from the time I was old enough to hold a pen." She looked down at the document wallet. "Richard chose the wrong woman to deceive. It just took me some time to stop being angry enough to do something useful about it." He took his hand off her shoulder. She turned. His face was doing the thing she'd learned to read over 5 days in the cabin: the processing, the internal recalibration, the specific look of a man taking in information that is changing the shape of something he thought he'd already mapped. "The Denver Tribune letter," he said. "The federal judge. The documents." He looked at her. "You have enough to go after Aldridge, too." The thought had been there since the moment she'd written Thomas Garrett, William Suggs, Marcus Beale, Henry Flood in her journal. She had not said it yet because she hadn't wanted to push, hadn't wanted to make him feel that she was using his situation as leverage of her own, that she had an agenda that required him. "I think so," she said carefully. "If the witnesses are findable, if their testimony is consistent, if the original hearing records can be accessed through federal channels." "Price," he said. "A federal judge has access to military tribunal records," she said. "Yes." He turned away from her, walked to the far end of the porch, stood with his back to her and his hands gripping the railing. She waited. The mountain waited. 15 years. He said to the trees and the snow and the distance, "I've been up here for 15 years because I told myself there was nothing to be done. That the record was the record, and the men with the power would keep the power, and the dead would stay dead, and the best I could do was stay out of the way of the machinery." His knuckles went white on the railing. "I told myself that was wisdom, that I'd earned the right to it." "Jedediah, I was hiding," he said. Dressed it up in a dozen different words, but that's what it was. He turned. His face was stripped completely bare. All the careful management gone. The walls gone, the 15 years of practiced containment gone. And what was underneath was a man with grief in him and fire in him, and something that had been waiting very patiently for 15 years for a reason to come back to life. 7 men. 7 of my men are buried at Fredericksburg because of Edmund Aldridge, and Edmund Aldridge is in Helena right now giving speeches about public virtue, and I've been carving wolves on a mountain." Charlotte's chest ached. "You survived," she said. "That's not nothing." "It's not enough," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't. But it's what you have to build from." He looked at her for a long moment, the longest they'd held each other's gaze since the first moment she'd opened her eyes in the snow and found him crouching over her. Something passed between them in that look, something too large for words and too real for pretense. "I need to think," he said. "Take all the time you need," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her. She said it again more quietly. "I'm not going anywhere." He went inside. She stayed on the porch alone with the mountain and the cold and the retreating sound of 4 horses descending toward Harlan's Crossing. She stood there until the cold pushed through even her resolve, and then she went inside too. He was at the bench, not carving, just sitting at it, both hands flat on the surface, looking at the wolf that still waited in its half-finished state. She sat at the table. Neither of them spoke for a long time. "I owe you an apology," he said eventually. She looked up. "For what?" "I told you I almost kept walking when I found you in the snow." He looked at the wolf. "I wasn't being entirely honest. I told myself I almost kept walking. But the truth is, I saw your coat in the snow from 100 yards away, and I was running before I decided anything. The decision came after." He paused. "I don't know what that means about me." "I think it means," Charlotte said carefully, "that you're a better man than you've been giving yourself credit for being." His throat moved. "I also think it means," she said, "that some part of you was ready, even if you didn't know it." He picked up the wolf, turned it in his hands, set it down facing her. "I've been making the same wolf for 15 years, he said. "I know, I noticed. I told myself it was because I was perfecting the technique. Is that what it was? No." He looked at it. "Mary told me once before the war. Before everything she said, the only thing that frightened her was that I'd forget to come home. Not that I'd die, that I'd forget." His voice was even, but the evenness was costing him. "The wolf was, I don't know, proof. Proof that I was still looking for the way back, even when I'd stopped believing there was one." Charlotte looked at the wolf, The wolf looked back with its head turned ears forward, catching the sound of something approaching. "Then maybe," she said quietly, "this is the way back." He didn't answer, but his hands came off the bench, and in the silence that followed, something that had been turning very slowly for 5 days completed its rotation, and what faced them now was not what had faced them when Charlotte Whitmore had first opened her eyes in a stranger's cabin and found 23 wolves watching her from the shelf. Outside the mountain was still. The snow was settling. The trail south to Harlan's Crossing was empty. But in the cabin, nothing was still anymore. Jedediah stood. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her with his hands at his sides and his face open in a way that must have cost him something she'd probably never fully understand. And he looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he thought was lost and has just found, with a recognition that is also in its own complicated way a grief for all the time it was missing. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I told you," she said. "Neither do I." "That's not reassuring." "I know." "Charlotte." "Jedediah." He reached out and touched her face, one hand, just his fingertips at her jaw, the lightest possible contact, as if testing whether she was real, as if he'd been fooled before by things that turned out not to be there. She was there. She put her hand over his and held it. And the mountain held its breath, and the fire held its heat, and 15 years of silence cracked down the middle like ice in a spring thaw. Not quietly, not gently, but with the inevitability of something that has been under pressure long enough that release is no longer a choice, but simply what happens next. He had warned her, had said it in a voice stripped of everything but truth. "I can't control myself around you." He hadn't meant danger. He'd meant this. He'd meant the crack in the wall. He'd meant the morning coffee set at the angle she'd used the day before, the hand over hers on the knife, the rifle picked up without hesitation when the horses came up the mountain, the name said into the dark at 4 in the morning, and then the thing said after "I know," as if he'd been given an answer. He'd meant all of it. He'd meant her, and Charlotte Whitmore, who had gotten on a stagecoach in Caldwell with a document wallet and a federal judge's name and a letter in the mail. And no destination, but North Charlotte Whitmore, who had never planned to end up here, who had planned only to get far enough away that she could finally be who she was. Put both her hands on either side of Jedediah Holt's face and looked him in the eye and felt for the first time in her adult life that she was standing in exactly the right place. "I'm still not going anywhere," she said. The fire burned. The wolves watched from their shelf. And in the morning, there would be decisions to make. Judges, witnesses, letters, a senator in Helena, who did not yet know that his past had found its way to a mountain cabin, and was even now being unpacked by a woman who thought in terms of evidence, and a man who had spent 15 years waiting to have a reason to come back. But that was morning. For now, there was only this, a hand against a face, a fire in a hearth, and 2 people standing in the wreckage of everything they'd been, and finding to their considerable surprise that the wreckage was excellent building material. They rode down to Harlan's Crossing 3 days later, Jedediah's idea. Charlotte hadn't pushed. She'd said her piece and meant it and then left it entirely in his hands because she understood by now that this was a man who could not be moved by pressure, only by his own arriving. And when he arrived completely. He came in from splitting wood on the morning of the 3rd day after Richard's visit, set the axe against the wall, poured himself coffee, and said, "We need to get to Helena before Peyton does. He has a 2-day lead and a faster horse, and if he reaches Aldridge before we reach Price, the shape of this whole thing changes." Charlotte looked up from her journal. "We," she said. "We," he said. He drank his coffee. "You have a problem with that?" "Absolutely none," she said. He packed light, the way men pack who have never had much, and have learned that much is not required. She packed the document wallet and her journal and her mother's cameo brooch and the small carved bird she'd made at his table, which had dried and hardened into something she was quietly proud of. She left the wet dress on the peg. It had finished drying, but it wasn't the right dress for what came next. She wore the one she'd mended by the fire, the one that was hers all the way through. Before they left, she watched him take the tin box from the shelf. He held it for a moment. Then he opened it and took out the 7 letters and put them in the inside pocket of his coat against his chest. He put the empty tin box back on the shelf where it had lived for 15 years, and he didn't look at it again. She didn't comment on it. She didn't need to. He locked the cabin with a key he wore on a cord around his neck, and they saddled his horse. One horse between them, which he'd explained was all he had, and which she'd accepted without drama, and they went down the mountain together into whatever was coming. Harlan's Crossing received them with the specific energy of a small town that has been waiting for something interesting to happen and has just had it arrive on horseback. People looked. Jedediah rode through it with his eyes forward, and his jaw set the posture of a man who has been invisible for 15 years and is choosing deliberately and at considerable personal cost to be visible now. Charlotte sat behind him and felt the steadiness of his back against her and thought, this is courage. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet, ongoing kind that doesn't announce itself. They stopped at the telegraph office first. She sent 2 telegrams. One to Judge Warren Price in Helena, formal and precise, stating that she was in possession of documents relevant to an estate fraud matter and requesting an appointment at his earliest convenience. The second to Gerald Foss at the Denver Tribune, advising him that the matter she'd referenced in her letter had developed significantly, and she would have additional information within the week. The telegraph operator, a thin young man with spectacular sideburns, read both messages with the practiced neutrality of his profession and the unconcealed avidity of a man who knew he was handling something significant. "These go out today," Jedediah said, not a question. "Yes, sir," the operator said, and meant it. From the telegraph office, they went to the sheriff. His name was Dale Curtis, and he was a broad, deliberate man in his 50s who had the look of someone who had seen enough of the world's capacity for nonsense to be beyond surprise, but not beyond interest. He looked at Jedediah for a long moment when they came in. "Holt," he said. Jedediah looked at him. "You know me. Know of you. Heard there was a man living up at Wolverine Peak. Heard some other things, too." Curtis leaned back in his chair. "Heard Edmund Aldridge's name in the same breath more than once. Been a while since I thought much about it." "Think about it now," Jedediah said. He laid it out flat. Fredericksburg, the tribunal, the 7 men, the 5 survivors. He said it the way he'd said it to Charlotte, stripped to the bone. No editorializing, just the sequential facts of what had happened and what had been done with those facts by men with the power to shape them. Charlotte watched Curtis's face while Jedediah talked. Watched the sheriff's eyes move from skeptical to attentive to something harder and more purposeful. When Jedediah finished, Curtis was quiet for a moment. "The witnesses," he said. "The 4 men you pulled out of that field, they still alive?" "Thomas Garrett's in Billings," Charlotte said. "That's confirmed as of 2 years ago. The others we're less certain of. That's part of why we need access to federal records through Judge Price." Curtis looked at her. "And you are?" "Charlotte Whitmore. I was traveling north on the Caldwell stage when it went down in the pass 9 days ago." She put the document wallet on his desk. "I'm also in possession of fraudulent estate documents that implicate a Philadelphia businessman named Richard Payton, who arrived in Harlan's Crossing 4 days ago and is likely still in the area." Curtis looked at the wallet, looked at Jedediah, looked at Charlotte. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who came to work on a Tuesday expecting an ordinary Tuesday. "All right," he said. He sat forward. "Start from the beginning, both of you." They were in Curtis's office for 2 hours. When they came out, Curtis had a copy of Charlotte's summary of the estate documents, a written account of the Fredericksburg Tribunal, signed by Jedediah, and a telegram of his own going to the federal marshal's office in Helena. He also had Charlotte suspected the makings of a very strong opinion about Edmund Aldridge that he'd been quietly holding for some time without sufficient cause to act on. "Peyton's still at the Harlan Hotel," Curtis told them as they left. "Got in 4 days ago, with 3 men been sending telegrams since he arrived. You should know that." "Thank you," Charlotte said. "Don't thank me yet," Curtis said. "Thank me when this is done." They found rooms at a boarding house on the far end of town. Separate rooms side by side, which Jedediah arranged with the landlady with a directness that left no room for the kind of speculative arithmetic that small-town landladies typically applied to unmarried travelers arriving together on one horse. The landlady, a Mrs. Pearl Adkins, took one look at Jedediah's face and decided arithmetic was unnecessary. That evening over supper in Mrs. Adkins' dining room, Jedediah said, "Peyton knows we're here." "Yes," Charlotte said. "He'll move fast." "He always does when he's losing ground. He overcommits." She cut her bread. "That's how I knew the letter would work. He doesn't have a strategy for opponents who've prepared for him in advance. He's only ever dealt with people he surprised." "You prepared for him a long time ago," Jedediah said. "I prepared for him the night I found those documents in my bag in Caldwell," she said. "Before that, I was—" She paused. "Before that, I was still trying to find a version of events where I wasn't in as much trouble as I was actually in. And after Caldwell, I was angry," she said simply. "Angry is useful. It focuses the mind." He looked at her across the table with that look she knew now, the assessment that had nothing cold in it, that was simply him seeing her clearly and not looking away from what he saw. "You're remarkable," he said. It was so direct and so plain and so entirely without the performance of a compliment that it hit her differently than compliments usually did. She felt color come into her face, which had not happened to her in recent memory. "Don't start saying things like that," she said. "I won't know how to respond to them." "I'll say them anyway," he said. "You'll figure out how to respond." She looked at her plate. She was smiling. She made no effort to stop. The telegram from Judge Price arrived the next morning. He would see them in 5 days. His clerk would arrange accommodations. He asked that the documents be kept secure and that no copies be made available to any party until they'd spoken. 5 days to Helena. Hard riding, but possible. They were at the stable arranging horses too this time. Jedediah insisting with the inflexibility of a man who had carried Charlotte's weight up a mountain once and had opinions about self-sufficiency when Richard Peyton found them. He came in with 2 men, not the hired riders from the mountain. Different men, bigger, with the specific look of people whose primary professional skill was standing in places and implying consequences. He looked at the 2 horses, at the saddlebags, at the clear evidence of imminent departure. "Leaving already," he said. "Helena," Charlotte said. She buckled the strap on her bag and didn't look at him. "Judge Price has agreed to see us." The silence that followed was extraordinarily loud. "Price," Richard said. "Warren Price, Federal District. I believe you've appeared before him once on a contract matter, 1876, I think. He ruled against you." She finally looked at him. "I thought that was appropriate." Richard's face was doing something complicated. She could see him running the calculation again, the ledger, and the ledger was not coming out the way it needed to come out. Price was insulated from the kind of pressure Richard applied well. Federal appointment, no local obligations, a documented record of ruling on the document's merits rather than the document holder's social standing. "Charlotte," he said. The pleasantness was gone entirely now. What was underneath it, finally fully exposed, was something smaller and colder than pleasantness. "You are making an enormous mistake." "I've made enormous mistakes," she said. "Accepting your proposal was one of them. This isn't." One of Richard's men moved. Jedediah already had his hand on the man's wrist. He hadn't appeared to move quickly. He'd simply arrived the way large, calm things arrive when they decide to, without announcement, without warning, with complete finality. His hand around the man's wrist was not a grip that invited discussion. "Don't," Jedediah said. The man looked at the hand on his wrist, looked at Jedediah's face, made the correct assessment. "We're leaving now," Jedediah said to Richard, maintaining the grip without looking at the man in it. "All 3 of you will remain in this stable for 10 minutes after we go. Sheriff Curtis knows we're here and knows your party is here and has been paying attention since yesterday morning." Richard looked at Curtis, who had materialized in the stable doorway with the unhurried timing of a man who had positioned himself there 5 minutes ago against exactly this possibility. "Morning, Mr. Peyton," Curtis said. Richard Peyton looked at Curtis. looked at Jedediah, looked at Charlotte. For the third time in 10 days, she watched him understand that something was not what he'd planned for it to be. But this time, the understanding had a different quality, not recalculation, not temporary retreat. The look of a man who has run out of angles. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Charlotte said, for the second time, with considerably more evidence to support it than the first. She took her horse's reins and walked out of the stable, and Jedediah fell in beside her, and they rode north out of Harlan's Crossing into the January cold, with Judge Price's telegram in Charlotte's coat pocket, and 7 names written in her journal, 4 soldiers and 3 letters that constituted between them the entire navigable future. They rode hard the first 2 days. Jedediah set the pace without discussion, and she matched it without complaint, and they stopped at dusk each day, and made camp with the practiced efficiency of 2 people who had learned each other's rhythms in a cabin on a mountain, and found that the rhythms transferred. He built the fire. She made the coffee. He cooked. She washed up. None of it was assigned. None of it was negotiated. It simply organized itself around what each of them was better at, and what each of them was willing to do, which Charlotte reflected was a more honest description of how 2 people managed a shared life than anything she'd observed in 3 years of Philadelphia engagement. On the second night, he told her about Garrett, not the name in the journal, the man. Thomas Garrett of Billings, formerly Private Thomas Garrett of the 9th Virginia Cavalry, who had been 19 years old at Fredericksburg and had lost 2 fingers on his right hand in the same engagement that had cost Jedediah the tip of his left little finger, and who had written to Jedediah once in 1869, a letter that had reached the Wolverine Peak cabin through a complicated chain of forwarding that Jedediah had never fully understood. "What did he say?" Charlotte asked. "He said he thought about us," Jedediah said. "He was looking at the fire. About our unit. About what happened. He said he'd tried to find the others, Suggs and Beale and Flood, and hadn't been able to find all of them. He said Suggs was dead pneumonia 1867. Beale he'd lost track of. Flood he thought was somewhere in Colorado." A pause. "He said he still thought about Aldridge." "What did you write back?" "I didn't." She looked at him. "I told myself it was because I had nothing useful to say," he said. The real reason was that writing back would have made it real again, made it something that existed in the present rather than something I'd left behind. His jaw worked. "I was wrong. I see that now. Garrett deserved a letter back." "Write him one from Helena," she said. "Tell him to come. Tell him what's happening." He was quiet. "His testimony matters," she said. "And I think he deserves to know that someone is doing something, that the 7 men at Fredericksburg didn't stop mattering the day the tribunal ruled." Jedediah looked at her across the fire. "You do that," he said quietly. "You take things that have been sitting in the dark and you say them out loud. Is that bad?" "No." He looked back at the fire. "It's just something I'm not used to." They reached Helena on the afternoon of the 4th day, having pushed hard enough on the 3rd to cut a day off the journey. Helena was bigger than Charlotte had expected, a real city territorial capital energy, the particular vitality of a place that knows it's becoming something. Judge Warren Price's office was on the 2nd floor of the federal building. Price himself was a compact, sharp-eyed man of 60, who had the look of someone who had spent 40 years listening carefully and had developed very good instincts for when he was being told the truth. He looked at the documents for 45 minutes without speaking. Charlotte sat across from him. Jedediah stood by the window. The clerk hovered near the door. Finally, Price set the papers down. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "these are serious." "Yes, sir," she said. "The signature variation on the transfer instrument is striking." He tapped the page. "I'm going to need your father's physician's records. His actual physician, not this Hargreaves. Dr. James Whitfield, Philadelphia. I have his address. And Mr. Peyton's attorney of record. Franklin Cade, also Philadelphia. He prepared the documents." Price wrote both names. He looked up at Jedediah. "And you're the Holt in this business?" "Yes, sir." "Fredericksburg, 1862. Price looked at the separate file his clerk had assembled from the military records Charlotte had sent ahead for them telegram from Harlan's Crossing, and Price had moved quickly. "The tribunal record is thin," Price said carefully. 3 witnesses, one of whom was in a field hospital, and gave written testimony rather than appearing in person. The officer who convened the tribunal was Colonel Edmund Aldridge, who was also the officer who gave the order, Jedediah said. "Yes, I noted that." Price looked at the file. "There is a substantial body of legal opinion that a tribunal convened and overseen by the accused party's commanding officer constitutes a conflict of interest that renders the findings voidable." He said it carefully, precisely the way judges say things when they're being accurate rather than making promises. Charlotte kept her face neutral. Jedediah was very still at the window. "Thomas Garrett of Billings," Charlotte said. "Survivor. Witness." "I'll want his deposition," Price said. "And Marcus Beals if he's findable. Flood too." He closed the military file. "Senator Aldridge will be informed that his tribunal record is under federal review. That's required by procedure." He looked at them both. "He'll know within the week." "We expected that," Charlotte said. "He has considerable influence in this territory," Price said. "We expected that too," she said. Price looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression that might, in a less formal context, have been respect. "Miss Whitmore, I'm going to ask you something directly, and I want a direct answer." "Of course." "Are you doing this for yourself for the estate matter, and using Mr. Holt's situation as supporting material? Or are both of these genuinely separate matters that happen to have landed in the same office?" Charlotte met his gaze. "They are separate matters that are both true," she said. "I will not pretend there isn't a convenience to the combination, but I would be here for either one alone." Price held her gaze for 3 more seconds. "All right," he said. "We'll proceed on both." They walked out of the federal building into the thin winter sunlight of Helena, and stood on the steps, and neither of them spoke for a moment. The weight of what had just happened was enormous in the specific way that enormous good things are not easy to carry, requiring both hands, not something you set down casually. "He said, 'Proceed,'" Charlotte said. "He did," Jedediah said. "He's going after Aldridge." "He's opening the review," Jedediah said, careful with the precision, because he'd been careful with hope for a long time and old habits hold. "That's not the same as Jedediah." She turned to him. "He's going after Aldridge." He looked at her, and then something happened in his face that she had not seen before, had not seen in 10 days of watching his face with the careful attention she'd brought to everything about him. His jaw didn't work. His eyes didn't go careful and managed. He didn't contain or compress or redirect. He just broke. Not apart. Open. His head dropped forward and his eyes closed, and he stood on the steps of the federal building in Helena, Montana, with his eyes closed, and 10 days of mountain and motion and confession and confrontation moving through him. And Charlotte put her hand on his arm and held on and let him have it, all of it. The 15 years and the 7 men and the tin box and the Sunday letters and the mountain that had been a prison and a refuge at the same time, let him have it without trying to manage it or minimize it or move past it to the next practical thing. He lifted his head. His eyes were wet. He didn't apologize for it. She didn't ask him to. "Write to Garrett," she said. "Today," he said, "and flood whatever address we can find. And Beal." "Yes." She squeezed his arm. He looked down at her hand, looked at her face, looked at the street ahead and the city around them and the winter sky above it all. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. "With this." He made a motion between them, the same motion she'd made in the cabin 10 days ago over the basin of dishes. "I've been alone for a long time, and I've gotten very good at being alone, and I cannot—" He stopped. His throat worked. "I cannot promise that I'll be good at this." "Neither can I," she said. "I was engaged for 3 years to a man who was very wrong for me, and I didn't notice until I ran. That's not the record of someone who has this figured out. Charlotte, we're both starting from nothing, she said. That's not a disadvantage. It means we get to build it the right way, instead of trying to fix something that was already built wrong. She looked up at him. That's what you told me about the wood. You're not putting something in. You're finding what's already there. He stared at her. You turned my own philosophy against me, he said. I retained it for future use, she said. I thought it was good. The corner of his mouth moved. Then more than the corner. For the first time in 10 days, for possibly the first time in 15 years, Jedediah Holt smiled. Fully, actually, without reservation or retreat. It changed his whole face. It changed the whole street. Charlotte felt the warmth of it like something physical. Don't do that, she said. Do what? Smile like that without warning. I need to prepare myself. He laughed. The sound of it surprised him. She could see it happen. The surprise at his own laughter, a man rediscovering a sound he'd forgotten his body could make. It was brief and real, and she filed it away with the carved wolf and the Sunday letters and the hand over hers on the knife and every other thing she intended to keep. 2 weeks later, the subpoena landed on Senator Edmund Aldridge's desk in Helena. Charlotte knew, because Curtis sent word from Harlan's Crossing, he had a contact in the territorial capital who kept him informed on the things worth being informed about, and the sight of a federal subpoena on Edmund Aldridge's desk was apparently very worth being informed about. The contact's message, relayed through Curtis, used the phrase considerable distress, and Charlotte read it twice before handing it to Jedediah across the table of the small house they'd taken rooms in near the federal district. He read it. Set it down. Considerable distress, he said. That's what the man says. Good, Jedediah said. It was the first time she'd heard something sharp in his voice, something with an edge. He set the paper down flat and pressed his hand over it for a moment, and then picked up his coffee. Thomas Garrett's reply came the following week. He would come. He was coming. He had been waiting. He wrote for something like this since 1869, when he'd sent a letter to a mountain in Montana and received no reply, and he had not given up waiting, because giving up on Jedediah Holt was not something he had the temperament for. He would bring his written account of Fredericksburg, and he would stand in front of any judge or jury or congressional committee that was put in front of him, and he would say what he saw and what he knew and what had been done to men who deserved better. Jedediah read the letter 3 times. Charlotte watched him read it and said nothing. When he set it down, his hand was not steady. He waited, Jedediah said. He waited, she confirmed. All that time. Some things hold, she said. Some loyalty holds past all reasonable expectation. You should know you're the reason his held. He looked at her. You saved his life, she said. At Fredericksburg. He's been carrying that for 23 years. That's not a man you write one letter to and walk away from. That's a man who was always going to come when you called. Jedediah folded the letter, put it in his inside coat pocket, against his chest where the 7 letters lived. 8 letters now. The estate proceedings against Richard Peyton moved through the federal system with the speed of something that has clear documentation and a judge who is paying attention. Dr. James Whitfield's records from Philadelphia arrived within the month her father's actual physician, who had documented the first stroke in detail, and whose notes were at direct variance with Hargreaves's certification. Cade Peyton's attorney retained counsel for himself within the week of the subpoena, which was the specific behavior of a man who understood that the ship he was standing on was going down and was calculating the distance to the nearest lifeboat. Richard Peyton himself came to Helena, not to see Charlotte, to see Price. She heard about it afterward from Price's clerk, a meeting that lasted 20 minutes, during which Richard had made 3 different arguments for why the documents should be deemed valid, and Price had listened to all 3 and said the same thing at the end of each. The evidence would be assessed on its merits. He did not come to find Charlotte. She thought about that, about what it meant, his absence, his choosing not to try again. And she understood he had finally made the correct calculation. The woman on the mountain porch was not a version of Charlotte Whitmore he had a strategy for. He would cut his losses. He would find another way to secure his interests. He was that kind of man, flexible in method, if not in nature, capable of redirecting when a particular road was closed. She felt surprisingly very little. Not triumph, not relief even, just the quiet settledness of something that has been correctly resolved. She wrote to her sister that evening. The first honest letter she'd written in years. She told her sister about the stagecoach and the mountain and Jedediah, all of it clearly and without performance. And at the end, she wrote, "I am well. I am more well than I have been in longer than I can count. I am somewhere that feels like mine." She sealed the letter and looked at what she'd written on the outside, the address of the small Helena house, and thought, yes. This address. Aldridge's hearing was scheduled for March. Garrett arrived in Helena in February on a Tuesday, and he was a lean, quiet man of 42 with a handshake that was careful because of the missing fingers and eyes that had the specific look of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and is finally, with enormous relief, setting it down. He and Jedediah stood in the front room of the Helena house and looked at each other for a long moment without speaking. Then Garrett said, "You look terrible." And Jedediah said, "You don't look much better." And they shook hands, the careful handshake the missing fingers accounted for. And something passed between them that Charlotte watched from the doorway and understood was not for her to witness fully, was a private accounting between two men and 23 years and 7 graves in Virginia, and she went to make coffee and gave them the room. The hearing was held on a Thursday in March before a federal review panel convened by Price in a room in the Helena Federal Building that was not large enough for the number of people who wanted to be in it. Garrett testified for 2 hours. His account was clear and precise and devastating in the way that simple eyewitness truth is devastating when it has been waiting 23 years for a room to say itself in. Edmund Aldridge sat across the room with 2 attorneys and the posture of a man who is very good at maintaining posture. When the panel asked Aldridge directly whether he had been informed of the compromised position before ordering the advance, his answer took 4 minutes and contained 17 qualifications. Garrett's answer to the same question asked of him earlier had taken 4 seconds. The panel took 3 days to deliberate. Their findings when they arrived were the findings of a body that had looked at the evidence and followed it where it led. The tribunal of 1862 had been improperly convened. The findings were voidable on the grounds of conflict of interest, and the military record of Sergeant Jedediah Holt was to be restored pending further review. The matter of Senator Aldridge's conduct was referred to the Senate Ethics Committee with the panel's formal recommendation that the referral be treated as urgent. Jedediah read the findings standing at the kitchen table. Charlotte read them over his shoulder. He set the papers down and put both hands flat on the table, that gesture, that anchor, and stood with his eyes closed and breathed. She put her hand between his shoulder blades. Neither of them spoke. Outside, Helena was conducting its ordinary march, business horses and voices and the sounds of a territorial capital that did not know or particularly care that something enormous had just been set right inside a small house near the federal district. The world carried on indifferent and busy, the way it always does when something that has needed correcting for a long time is finally corrected. It doesn't stop for it. It doesn't mark it. It just continues, and the correction sits inside it, real and permanent, whether or not anyone is watching. "Jedediah," Charlotte said. He opened his eyes. "It's done," she said. He turned. He looked at her. And his face, God, his face, stripped all the way back to something she suspected was the man he'd been before Fredericksburg, before the tribunal, before Mary, and the long mountain winter young, in some bone-deep way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with weight that had been laid down. "It's not done," he said. "Aldridge is still. The Senate will handle Aldridge," she said. "Garrett will see to it. Price will see to it. You've done your part." She held his gaze. "It's done, Jedediah. The record says who you are now." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "What do we do now?" She looked at the kitchen, at the 2 coffee cups on the table, at the window with its view of the Helena Street. at the small carved bird sitting on the windowsill where she'd put it when they arrived. The bird she'd made at his workbench on the third day in the cabin. The bird she'd carried wrapped in her handkerchief all the way from Wolverine Peak to a federal city 60 miles north. "I want to go back to the mountain," she said. He blinked. "Not to hide," she said quickly, "not to exile ourselves, but because it's—" She stopped, found the right word. "It's ours. That cabin, that mountain. It became ours somewhere in the middle of a blizzard, and I'd like to go back to it knowing that it's a home we chose instead of a place we were trapped." He looked at her. "You'd go back up there," he said, "to a one-room cabin with a woodworking bench and 23 wolves and no nearest neighbor for 14 miles. 24 wolves," she said. "I'm going to keep making them. I'm getting better." Something moved through his face, the warmth, the crack. The light coming in through it, and he reached out and took her face in both hands, the way he'd done once before in the cabin after Richard left, with the same quality of careful disbelief of a man touching something he'd been certain wasn't real. "Charlotte Ann Whitmore," he said. "Jedediah Holt," she said. "I can't control myself around you," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm counting on it." He kissed her, not carefully, not with reservation or management, or the calibrated restraint of a man who has spent 15 years governing every impulse he possessed. He kissed her the way the mountain broke after a storm, completely inevitably, with the force of everything that had been building behind the silence. She kissed him back the same way, and somewhere in Helena, on an ordinary Thursday in March, a man who had gone up a mountain to disappear came back to life in a kitchen with 2 coffee cups on the table and a carved bird on the windowsill. And the woman who had fallen out of a stagecoach and into his solitude held his face in her hands and understood with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has finally stopped performing and started living that she had not been running away from Philadelphia. She had been running toward this, toward him, toward the person she became when she stopped being afraid. They went back to the mountain in April, when the pass was clear and the world was thawing, and Wolverine Peak was showing the first green under all that white. Jedediah unlocked the cabin, and they went in together, and the wolves were where he'd left them, and the empty tin box was on the high shelf, and the workbench was waiting. He put the 8 letters, 7 from Mary, 1 from Garrett, in the tin box together. He put the box back on the shelf. Charlotte watched him do it, and understood not buried, not erased, held. The past in its proper place, honored and present, and no longer a prison. She set the carved bird on the mantel between 2 wolves where the morning light would find it. He stood behind her and looked at it. "It needs work," he said. "Teach me?" she said. That was where it began, the real beginning, the one that counted. Not in a storm, not in crisis, not in the drama of confrontation and revelation, but in an ordinary April morning, in a one-room cabin with a workbench and a fire, and 2 people sitting down together to make something out of what they had. He had warned her he couldn't control himself around her. He had been right. He had loved her helplessly, completely past every wall he'd built, and it had not destroyed him. It had returned him to himself. And Charlotte Whitmore, who had once accepted an arrangement she did not want because grief had made her tired, sat in the mountain light with a piece of pine in her hands, and a man beside her who saw her clearly and chose her freely, and she was not tired anymore. She was at last entirely and irrevocably home.